Great. Thank you so much. Looking forward to a chance to chat with you all today. And we're going to provide a broad-ranging presentation, lift the hood a little bit on what did we do. So we'll share with you both the guidebook that we recently completed with our partners at the state, ELCD, and the model code that's included in that guidebook. But also just wanted to share with you a little bit our process and conclude with some lessons learned because we're currently in the midst of a handful of projects helping cities actually implement these requirements. So, open with a really intentionally provocative question about, is Oregon outlawing suburbia? So I think we just want to give a chance to walk you through what is CFEC and what is the expectation from the state in terms of what cities are required to do. First and foremost, my name's Pauline Ruegg. I'm a senior associate with Cascadia Partners here in Portland, and I was the project manager for this project. I am trained as a planner and urban designer. Been working for almost 25 years now, and really above all else, I consider myself a student of the physical environment. So really learned a lot and got to apply that in this project. And I'd like to turn it over to my colleague Jamin, who's also here today.
Yeah, hi, good afternoon, everyone. Looking forward to the discussion today. My name's Jamin Kimmel. I'm a partner with Cascadia Partners, and I tend to lead up most of our projects that have some nexus with zoning and development code. So I'm a land use planner and work in the realm of everything ranging from housing policy and housing planning to urban design issues and design standards. But really have my passion is zoning, which not many people say, but that's what it is. And so bring that to this project. Also want to recognize I was part of the principal in charge for the work we're going to review. Also want to recognize Alex Joyce played a key role from our firm, who is another partner in shaping some of the big picture ideas that went into the guidebook. Oh, and this slide is me as well. So our firm, Cascadia Partners, we're a firm of about 20 staff. We're based in Portland, have some staff around the state though as well. We have a relatively interdisciplinary practice, planning and development strategy for a firm of our size, ranging from zoning and development code, which we're going to focus a lot on today, real estate strategy. More recently, we added some new staff to bolster our expertise in urban design and placemaking, housing policy and planning, which I do a lot of, public engagement, sustainability related planning, and particularly focus on urban forestry and tree regulations. And then broader urban analytical studies, including scenario planning we do as well, and then also some visual communications. So that's kind of what we do. And luckily this CFEC guidebook really drew on a lot of different parts of our practice, and looking forward to getting into it.
Thanks, Jamin. So just so you know where we're headed today, I'm going to provide a little bit of an overview of the CFEC program. It's been around for a while, and a lot of you are familiar with it, but it's just always helpful as we spend a lot of time wading through all the different aspects. Just remember the bigger picture. Then want to introduce you to this guidebook that we recently published, share our thoughts and some of our challenges, and look at the model code more closely and present those lessons I was mentioning. So what is CFEC? Climate-friendly, equitable communities. So it really starts from in 2007, Oregon setting a policy goal to reduce climate change and to reduce the impacts of that. And then climate-friendly, equitable communities stemmed from that. So in a few years after setting that goal, the state realized that they were really not meeting those targets of reducing climate impact, and specifically in the area of reducing pollution related to transportation. So driving cars, it was just not coming to where they wanted it to be. Couple that with some other key factors, right? There's record heat waves, extreme weather events, the really tragic fires, and then also beginning to look a little more closely at what's the relationship between zoning and planning and how that affects questions of equity and investment. And so looking at all of that together, the state created this program, Climate Friendly Equitable Communities, looking at setting rules around how communities across the state need to plan and start to address some of those concerns. So CFEC is a very large policy umbrella. There's pages and pages of rules related to this. And we were lucky enough, we only had to focus on maybe 2 pages of all those rules. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention the bigger picture. So there's a whole set of rules related to transportation planning, specifically how to change how transportation system plans are conducted. Also issues around electric vehicles, infrastructure, bike parking, things like that. But when we turn to the realm of land use specifically, there's, I think, kind of 3 big buckets that we think about. So there's different timing of these and requirements related to them. So I think everyone's familiar with the parking reform. So this mandate to remove parking minimums, that was the first part of CFEC that kicked in, where requirements had to be met by local jurisdictions. Then there's the climate friendly areas. So designating specific areas where you really want to promote and allow that type of dense mixed use development that would support walkability. And then lastly, kind of the last thing that started to kick in here is the land use regulation. So adopting design standards to really support those walkable goals. And that's where we focused in on, and that's specifically OAR 660-012-033-0. So this is really the substance of our project. So if you look at the OAR themselves, the state had a rule which requires jurisdictions to regulate land use to support compact, pedestrian-friendly, mixed-use development patterns. That sounds great, but what does that mean? And that was really our charge. How do you break that down? How do you help a city interpret what they actually have to do to meet that mandate? And that was our challenge. A couple basic things, just so we all had the same understanding. So who's required to meet these 0330 land use rules? It's the 8 largest metropolitan areas across the state. When do they have to do that? When before or on a major TSP update. So part of this is really trying to coordinate land use and transportation planning, hence that trigger. Where was an interesting question that we really had to dive into, and I think our second challenge, which was we came to realize quickly, it's the entire city. It's within the entire urban growth boundary. It's all zones, including those CFAs that cities are in the midst of designating. It's covering all of that area. The only exception is areas that have an industrial or rural character. So how does walkable design look across an entire city? It's a very broad question. I want to clarify though, we're only looking at the land use regulations. So in this photo, we're only looking at the area to the right. And this is a point of controversy that we struggled with and continue to, which is that we're only looking at the private land and we're not looking at that street and that sidewalk that come right up to the building. And that obviously has a huge impact on walkable outcomes, but that was not within our purview. So we began to wrestle with this question of what is walkable design? Well, we know it when we see it, you know, it's all these individual elements. And we started to think through what is it? What are the different types of standards we need to take on? And if you start from a place like this, I think we really quickly got to, well, what do most spaces in cities look like today? Well, not really all that walkable, right? I mean, I think we see these images and they ring very true for us. It's something that we see day in and day out across the state and frankly, across the country, which is very unwalkable spaces. And so that's the question that we begin to ask ourselves, how are we going to change that? So just on a personal note, I spent months and months wrestling with this question and saying, well, what is it that we want to take on? What must we take on? And I started doing all these field trips across the city, driving around, trying to understand this as a student of form. And one day I happened to drive by a scene like this image on the right, and I saw a couple of kids out on this sidewalk holding a lemonade stand. And I just thought, what in the world? Why are these kids having a lemonade stand in this setting? And the image on the left is my kid. And so she is very entrepreneurial and she loves setting up a lemonade stand. And she's got it down to a science. And I think what became clear to me as I thought about why are these kids having this lemonade stand? Well, I think they figured something out, which is there wasn't enough foot traffic through that subdivision that they lived in to actually get enough customers. And so they had to get out on the roadside. Now, of course, you notice there's no place for somebody to pull over. And what's the speed limit on this road? And it's just not fundamentally a walkable place. And so that I think really started to help inform us on what are we really fundamentally changing if the rules in place give us things like the right, there's just no place for lemonade stands in that type of instance. So we started breaking it down. What are all the pieces we need to address? You know, let's take it apart. The standards for walkability, we need to look at a district scale, a block scale, an individual building or lot scale. Walkability is at all of those different scales, but also it needs to all come together. So to really get to walkability, you need to do all the different parts of it. You need to have the scale of development, the buildings in certain locations, orientations. You need to have connections through, you need to have connections to transit. And so once we had this fuller sense of where we were going, we really got excited and started putting pen to paper. So that leads us to this guidebook. I want to orient you to the guidebook itself before we get into kind of the most meaty part of that, which is the model code itself. So initially, really, the project was just to create the model code. But frankly, we wanted to do more. And we see this guidebook as the word manifesto is much too strong, but it's setting out a vision for what is walkable design. And it's also a resource for people trying to understand what is the state's vision for walkable design. So it is consists of several parts. First, there's an introduction, which really covers the material I've walked through you right now. Then there's 3 different topic chapters, and these are really the parts of 0330 that we broke down. So there's pedestrian-oriented development, there's connectivity and access, and then compact development. So for the first 2 chapters, there's a similar set of resources, and then I'll cover this in a minute. The compact development's a little bit of a different beast. So what does it look like inside the guide? We decided to give users a lot of resources. So there are numbers and names, and these they actually correspond exactly to the model code. So it's easy to see the connection there. And then we included climate benefits. So if this is fundamentally about achieving climate benefits, it helps a city to understand what this type of standard is going to accomplish or what's the goal. Likewise, there's an intent up here. So what does it look like? What does it feel like? How do you know you're doing it correctly? A lot of that has to do with the fact that this is a model code. So it's presented as one way a community could create walkable design outcomes, but it's not the only way. So we're providing all of these resources for the users so that they can sort of pick and choose and adapt and make their own choices. So to provide that type of guidance, we had several items. So first, there's these key considerations. So we walked through different choices that they might make. Well, what if this is in this type of a town or this type of a district? What if it's a community that's ready to go further? What if it's a community that's still trying to move the bar just a little bit? The second resource that we provide is all these images. So, you know, you have to see it to know it, and it's so important to get a sense of what is or is not working and really just illustrate that for everybody. And then all of those are sitting right alongside the model code language itself. So a user can look at those 2 things and start to understand what are the choices and begin to make those choices. So compact development was a little bit of it was really an interesting question. So when you start to realize that we're looking at the entire city and all the cities within these 8 metro regions, and they all have different zones with different permitted uses, with different development standards. And frankly, it just sort of blew our minds. There's not like one solution or range of solutions that really can answer that for a community. And so where we landed on is another type of benchmark, which is we sort of reverse engineered to say, well, what are the forms of development that would really represent a level and a scale of development that is walkable, right? Or transit supportive. Now, let's envision that the zoning code or the building code was not in the way of that outcome. And what would the market want to provide? And a lot of that is driven by exactly the building code, the height. And so we identified this set of compact development types here, and we provided a set of outcomes, built outcomes. And so that allows the city to look at these development types and say, oh, that's actually really something that would advance our growth goals or advance our placemaking that we're looking for along this key corridor. Now they could look at that built outcome and compare it to their existing zoning and see if there's some mismatch. Maybe they have a minimum lot size that's really just not going to be the same, or very realistically a height limit. So we thought that was a useful tool, but we spent the majority of our time really focused on the model code, which is looking much more at the design standards aspect, not the development standards. All right, so the model code, which is really sort of the meat and potatoes, as I like to say, of this guidebook. So the model code is an opportunity for the state to set a benchmark of what does it mean for a walkable design? What are the standards that you'd want to consider? And it's also a benchmark in that it's a tool that communities can compare vis-a-vis their existing zoning to say, are we doing this? How close are we? How far off are we? So it's also a model code in that it's broad. It is, we identify ranges and we identify types of approaches, but it is a tool that cities can adapt. And that's what we're currently helping cities do, is adapt to their own existing structure. It does reflect best practice approaches. That's another thing I neglected to mention. In the guidebook, we did spend a lot of time looking at how are cities across the country, and we did a deep dive on cities within the state doing this currently. What are some of the best code approaches? And so we reflected that in the guidebook. If it didn't make itself into the model code, we do have some best practices included in there for those communities ready to think about things a little bit differently or go further. So in the model code itself, it was this very interesting challenge of, here's an ideal of walkable design. How do we translate that into some really specific code language? And how do we make that clear and objective? So there is the state requirement that any standard applied to residential uses must be clear and objective. But we also believe it's good code writing to always, where you can, provide at least one set of clear and objective standards for an applicant to meet. And so we set the bar of creating clear and objective standards for non-residential uses as well. So these really are design standards and not design guidelines. So I'm going to walk you through not the entire content of the model code, but just kind of some of the key aspects of it. And so really, I would present this to you all as we take this tour of our city environments. On the left is the type of physical environment or physical form that I would argue represents a non-walkable outcome. And on the right is the form that's more of what we're seeking to promote. And then that's really how we created the design standards, as we thought, well, there's the thing that isn't working. So what do we require instead to get it to a more workable form that would work? So I'm just going to walk you through these and just give you a broad overview before Jamin shares some of our lessons learned. So this is a very common one where the parking is in front of the building. It's set back. This is found across all commercial zones. And so we looked at what is the building orientation standard requiring the building to come up to the front of the lot. No parking may be provided in front of the building. It may be provided to the side. And then we also looked at setting a maximum setback in certain areas. If the city wanted to focus on a corridor or a zone where there was some flexibility, where a portion of a building could come up to the front of the lot, but some portions could be set back if there were certain amenities provided in that. So we want to provide a street wall and frame that street, but also we want to retain some flexibility for developers and for cities. And also something we struggled with a lot is there's a lot of public work standards that can make this really challenging. So I'll take public utility easements and put those off to the side because we didn't solve that problem. So this is building orientation specifically in commercial settings. Then looking at ground floor design for residential uses. So specifically, we wanted to provide a new alternative look. Right now, many cities require some amount of commercial uses on the ground floor, and that's the way that the street space is activated. So we put forward this idea for a new and alternative to that, which is that ground floor residential uses actually can activate the street space. Now, a very common outcome that we see is this to the left, where a building is built right up to the front of the sidewalk, but there's no privacy for the residents. So it doesn't work for the people in the building. And I would argue it doesn't really work for the people walking by the building either. So it's sort of a lose-lose. So we looked at instead providing a choice for cities to think about requiring some amount of ground floor units having individual entries to have that coming and going, the same as a commercial building would activate the sidewalk. And then we also looked at the design elements that would be required, along the front of that frontage. So we looked at if it's going to be residential uses, there's some competing concerns about privacy. So if the building is going to be set back, there's a transition space that we're calling for, which is 5 to 10 feet here, where a building must be developed with certain number of design elements. So we created a clear and objective menu, and they have to provide a certain amount of these transition elements to distinguish the private space from the public space. So that could be landscaping, it could be a slight elevation change, it could be a low wall. So we created a list of those elements. All right, sometimes I am told that I'm a little obsessed with driveways, but I think if you were to add up the square footage of driveways across America, I would put that challenge out. I think it is one of the most impactful pieces of our infrastructure that changes and affects how we experience a very unwalkable place. So as I always say, leave no mini curb cut behind. So this is my personal mission. And so we spent a lot of time looking at this, and driveways are a very complex issue. And this is, I would say, one of those issues where we struggled with also, we don't want to preclude or counter in any way the great work that the state is doing to promote housing development and really meet that housing need. But there's also, we want to think about the impacts of that type of development or residential development on the sidewalk. So we looked at two aspects here, two facets, both the total width of that driveway and the separation between curb cuts. And there's some really interesting challenges we found there in terms of the actual building type or housing type. Attached triplexes or quadplexes are really a lot of curb cuts. So some really interesting issues we got into there. Related are garage widths and their setbacks. So a lot of buildings, housing development is still very prominent, visually prominent garages. So the car is really still what you're seeing about these buildings. And there's an aspect of the rules that calls for sociable development patterns. And so in our interpretation of that, we want to really switch this dynamic where the social aspects of residential development take up more space and are more visually prominent than the garages. So we looked at two facets again. So the overall width, the proportion that garage takes up of the overall building facade, and then also provided the option for communities to look at requiring that garage to be set back. So even further reduce its visual prominence. Drive-through facilities. A lot of cities have just prohibited these in certain districts, but we found there's an opportunity to go further than that, which is in districts where they are permitted. What about some design standards that really, again, switch kind of who is the most prominent user of this? So this is an inherently auto-focused land use. And what we see so often is that the drive-through lane is what goes right along the sidewalk. There's cars there idling. It's very challenging to access that building on foot, either through the parking lot or from the sidewalk. So we created a set of design standards that talk again about building orientation and providing a option for someone on foot to either walk into the building or have an exterior walk-up window where they can get the same level of service as somebody in a car. Two last ones I want to highlight for you. There is specifically also Rule 0405, which is looking at large parking lots. So I think parking lots over 2 acres in size. So one of the key aspects there is when there's a very large parking lot, there need to be these connections and these safe connections through the parking lot so that someone can get there from the sidewalk all the way to the front entry. They don't necessarily have to come by their car to access that use. There's also aspects around climate and tree canopy and solar generation. We didn't look at those aspects, but they are in the model code. The state actually took on that part. What we looked at is what is a safe and frequent connection through a parking lot. And so often there's a minimum 5-foot standard. I think you see what that looks like in so many places. And I always put myself in the position of, if I'm trying to walk with my kids to a store, what does that feel like? Would much prefer the option on the right. That's a wider, clearly visually distinct, sometimes even elevated at grade, safe passageway so that I can move through that parking lot to where I'm going. And then lastly, we did look at that district larger scale in terms of connectivity, how to require those connections through a site. So that's both connections to streets. So where do the streets actually line up? And this has to do with the block size, which Jamin will get into a little bit, but connections through a site, both for a street and pedestrian and bike level, but also starting to look at connections within a site. And so one thing that we explored a little bit is if there was a lot of interest. So we had a technical advisory group, and there was some interest in having pedestrian or bike access ways as an alternative to having a full street connection. So looking at other less expensive, sort of smaller scale ways to create that porous site and connect into other surrounding key destinations. So it was something that we looked at and wanted to provide a standard for as an option. So the work isn't done. I think I want to present this to you all, and I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on how jurisdictions can continue to push the envelope for walkable design and take on all, I want to show this full photo of what creates a walkable place, and just remind everybody that it's, as you all know, not just what happens on that lot, but everything that leads up to it and surrounds it. And I think a big part of how we saw the charge of this project is integrating all those different needs and aspects and putting them in one document. So I think something we really did that's subtle in the model code is we found a place to reference those other standards that so often function independently. So, you could have a design standard, but there's a public works standard sitting over here that's really guiding how driveways are spaced. And so we found a landing place in this model code to really force that conversation and for cities to start to integrate those different aspects of transportation and land use planning. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Jamin. And I'm happy to keep sharing my screen, Jamin, if you just want to let me know how to advance the slides in terms of some of our current lessons learned.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'll be very brief. I know we're coming up on time for the presentation part. I'm going to just cover how this work is going in actually implementing some of these potential code changes in some of the communities we're working with. And want to recognize, I see staff from many of those cities on this call and other calls calling in. And so this is hard work. These are complicated. It's a little easier to write a model code than it is to apply it and tailor it to a city. It has an existing code. It has a history. It has a development pattern that's already there. And so I want to talk a little bit about how that's going and encourage others who are working on this work to chime in when we get to the Q&A. So I want to talk about, I'm going to go through a few issues, and I want to sort of talk about how consistent are existing codes with some of these standards. And so our first step in implementing these changes is to do a code audit, and we're going to take an assessment of the city's existing regulations. And so I thought it might be interesting to present to you all sort of our impression of, in working with a number of different communities, how consistent they are with these standards and their current regulations. And so kind of have sort of a smiley face spectrum here. I'll give you a sense of it. So first issue, maximum block length. This is a key street connectivity issue, making sure you don't have blocks that are too long that create, far out of network, out of indirect travel routes for pedestrians. But that question of how long is too long, where do we set that threshold? It's somewhere between 400 and 700 feet, but that can vary. People have different perspectives on that. So that's a challenging issue to figure out. And there's also some desire for variation by zone within the city or the different contexts within the city. So thinking through how we apply a maximum block length standard. And a big reason for that is streets are expensive. So there's an interest in limiting the amount of street network that needs to be provided, and in the interest of limiting the cost of development as a major trade-off situation here. We also know that results in less connected street networks. Next slide. Pedestrian and bicycle access ways. So first off, the overall impression on this one is that many cities do have this allowance, and the basic allowance is that these sort of mid-block connections could be provided in lieu of a full street connection in some instances or some situations, but usually it's limited to certain kind of conditions, or it's an exception to providing a full street. And so that question of what are the conditions under which you can provide a access way in lieu of a full street connection, in most cases, we are recommending that cities allow this more broadly than they do today in their existing code, for the purposes of making sure you continue to have that pedestrian and bicycle connectivity, while also managing that impact of the cost of providing a full street connection. But there's other questions that come up with these maintenance obligations. Who owns this? Is it the HOA? Is it the public sector? And how you design them to be safe, comfortable. What kind of design standards need to be in place to make sure they're not a narrow passageway that's dark with 8-foot fences on both sides. So that's something we're working on. Building orientation and parking. I put this on the spectrum of a little less consistent generally, these kinds of standards in cities' codes today. Mainly, this is something that we see if there's a prohibition between parking in between the building and the street, or a maximum setback standard. Those are usually limited to cities sort of downtown or main street zones, or certain key corridors where they've done sort of a planning process and decided that's a important policy goal. General commercial areas, this is pretty common to not have any kind of limitation on parking being between building and the street. So challenging issue, because that's a very predominant development pattern. So the question often is it enough to just prohibit parking between the building and the street? Does that get you enough of the way there to a more walkable outcome? Or do you also need to have a maximum setback that ensures that building is brought up to the front of the street? So that's a challenge. Thinking through that. I think in many cases, prohibiting parking between the building and the street will naturally result in developers making a choice to bring the building up to the street. Otherwise, it's sort of a what are you going to use the rest of that space for? And then when the building is set back further, is there a need for standards for what happens in the frontage between the street and the building? What does that look like? How does that pedestrian friendly if it's not the building that's sort of engaging with the street and contributing to the streetscape? Next slide. So similarly, this ground floor design standards tend to also be linked with building orientation standards. So if a city has that kind of standard in a downtown or certain districts, they also tend to have ground floor design standards. Things like requiring a minimum amount of windows, weather protection, things like that. There's some questions about, does this work on those more auto-oriented materials? How would this work? These are the questions we're getting. We think it can, but it is an open question, and it's not something you see as often. Buildings coming up to the street, providing a lot of transparency on an auto-oriented corridor, which has narrow sidewalks. It's one of the challenging parts about implementing this kind of standard in a suburban context. Couple other just quick questions here. I think one I want to point out the most here is there's sometimes a question, is there a viable alternative to transparency? So windows really create that sense of eyes on the street, activity, views into activity. But there's still some uses that don't work well with having large windows on them. And they can be more costly in terms of development. And so we're asking that question is there a viable alternative that replaces that same function in terms of creating a more walkable environment? We don't have an answer for that yet. We think probably not. So let's go to the next slide. In terms of ground floor design for residential, very few cities have standards that actually address the specific issue that we thought was most pertinent, which is when you have residential units that are right close up to the street, how do they relate to the street and create an interesting and active street frontage? And so we think many cities are welcoming that adding those kinds of standards. But then one of the key issues is it going too far to require that not only that the building have certain design elements on the frontage, but that their entries actually open onto the street. We think that's a key factor in making it more walkable and more active environment. But it also has implications for floor plan layout and design and a lot of things that may complicate development. And next slide. So garage design. So this issue of how do we make garages less prominent when they need to be provided on the front of the house? Is it the width of the garage that's most important, or is it the setback? We tend to think it's kind of both. And is it enough to just prevent snout houses? So is it enough to make sure that the garage is at least not protruding in front of the main of the dwelling, or does the garage need to actually recess behind the main facade of the dwelling? And that's sort of a key decision a lot of cities are making. And then at what point should alley access be required? When are the lots too narrow, the frontages of each building too narrow, where the garage, it's impossible, even with single car garages, to have that not be a dominant part of the facade. Okay, next slide. Or is that it?
I think that's it. Yeah.
I think that was the last one. Great. So now we have questions in the chat. Fiona, were you going to go through and sort of summarize those for us?
Just want to pause and say, wow, there's a lot to chew on. Thank you so much for kind of giving us I know this is probably like 2% of the guidelines that you're all working on. So thank you for sharing this. Let's see. I'm going to jump into some questions. Feel free to, if folks have some, go ahead and plop them in. I think just to kind of start us off, there's a lot of terms that are kind of thrown around: rulemaking, standards, guidelines. Could you help this group kind of organize their thoughts on like what do those terms mean, and kind of what are the implications of rules versus guidelines and enforceability, and just kind of break that down from your understanding working with the state?
I'm going to hand that one off to Jamin.
All right, I'm the rules guy, I guess. So yeah, when we say rules, there's probably a few different ways that Pauline was using that term throughout this, but I would think about this at a few different levels. So there's the administrative rules, which we did not write, but were set by the state. And so those are the OARs. That is the guiding, that is what cities must comply with. All right. And so cities do not need to adopt the model code or comply with every aspect of the guidebook or be consistent with every aspect of the guidebook. The guidebook is intended to help them comply with the rules, right? So the rules are for cities. That's the target. For individual developments as part of a land use application, they're subject to the city's rules, right? And so this is a guidebook for the city to help to update their own rules and codes. The guidebook includes both guidelines, which we would for cities of what kinds of standards we think make the most sense and what kind of considerations should go into writing those standards. Cities could choose to then comply with these rules through, they do need to have at least one set of clear and objective standards that would be available to housing development applications. So I would consider those what you think of as rules. Those are clear, objective, and precise. They can have alternatives to those clear and objective standards. So you might think of like design guidelines. If a city does not want to comply with one of the clear and objective rules, they could opt into, or an applicant, excuse me, could then opt into complying with design guidelines. We wrote design standards for the model code as sort of that baseline of what the city will be required to have, something like that. But guidelines could be part of the mix. But in terms of residential development, they do need to be an alternative to clear and objective rules.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Let's see, another question. So I think, this was kind of similar as you guys were going through it to something that I was thinking about, and just kind of like, how far off are we? Now that you've kind of got this gold star of like what a walkable city should look like. Are you finding that there's huge gaps? Have you been doing little kind of audits of cities to kind of understand like how much work needs to be done versus has already been done? Kind of looking at codes more in depth. Yeah. Could you just like put a measurement on that, I guess?
Yeah. First, I think it's also worth noting, that these compliance is a little bit different in this case, and there's a large amount of flexibility afforded by DLCD. And so that's contrasted a little bit with the more recent middle housing rules, where they were much more prescriptive. And so what we have found is it really is a judgment call for individual cities and for individual zones as to which standards are not consistent or not compliant. And so I think that the state has set this up as a tool to begin to just elevate everybody. And really, compliance looks like analyzing and looking at your current zones and identifying areas that you want to go further. So it's not going to look the same as everybody across all cities and counties and jurisdictions doing the same thing. So there is a lot of variation, which is fascinating. And a lot of that also provides flexibilities for cities within the context of the other code changes or policy changes that they're currently implementing. So I would say first and foremost, it's been a little bit of leading where the cities, following where the cities are ready to go. And so that sets some of how we determine if a location is or is not consistent. Now, that being said, I think there's been some certain key things that have jumped out, and Jamin, please jump in here. I think all the cities we've looked at have a lot of zones that are very, very consistent with these walkable objectives. And they're downtowns, they have certain overlays or plan districts or special districts that are very much aligned with all of these. And they're doing quite well. Some of the gaps I think that we've started to notice across jurisdictions is commercial zones. As Jamin was pointing out, there's almost no design standards applied to your general commercial zones. And a lot of those are also really built out. So there's a lot of interesting questions around applicability there. Almost no cities have design standards applied to their single family and now duplex uses. So in terms of those driveways and those garages, I think also looking at requiring some very minimum amount of transparency and entry orientation standards for those single and two family uses. We really don't see a lot of those. I think those are the major ones jumping out for me. Jamin, anything to add?
Yeah, I think you pretty much covered it, but I think the maybe a bigger picture question about sort of how will this roll out over time and be implemented? I think I just want to recognize that cities and counties, I know we have a couple from Washington County and Clackamas County, and the urban parts of metro area counties are also subject to these rules. So we say cities as a shorthand, but we're not overlooking at counties. The deadline for complying with these rules is by a TSP update, and there's a calendar for when the cities need to update their TSPs, and some of those are pretty far out in the future. It could be 2029, it could be past that. Those are on a cycle, and so this is not all going to happen all at one time in one big wave. This sort of be slowly as cities sort of update their TSP. They'll at that point will likely become compliant. Other cities might choose to become compliant earlier. I also want to recognize that there's a bit of CFEC fatigue out there in the communities we're working with. They just went through climate friendly areas designation, which may be a contentious issue. They went through parking reform, which was definitely a contentious issue in a lot of places. And so, yeah, sometimes we're coming along now and they're like, CFEC again. That's just an observation of something that's coming up. Hopefully that doesn't negate from the value and importance of doing this kind of work, but it is a challenge.
Makes sense.
I think we also, for all those reasons, created the larger guidebook to hold on to those ideas and start to, set out a narrative of what is this and what are all the different things to contemplate. And each location will get there at its own time, in its own context and its own character.
Great. All right, I'm going to kind of intersect a couple of questions here, and just kind of maybe to paraphrase, I think there's a lot of questions and interest in hearing more about site design and kind of like the front door entry. If you put parking in the back of a building, kind of what becomes your front door. And I guess I'm kind of wondering too, have you found any economic studies that really kind of like put some metrics on like pedestrian bike patronization versus from the auto, and just kind of like from a site planning perspective, what are you seeing in terms of like ideal front door location or double front doors? I'm sure you did a fair amount of talking with tenants and property owners about these kind of things. So yeah, just kind of if you could summarize your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that is a great question. I think this is another one of those areas of the code where code can only go so far. So there can be a requirement to have a main entrance off a sidewalk and the orientation standard to bring the building there, and a definition of what is a main entry. But I've personally walked up to buildings where that main entry is locked and there's a hand sign on it that says main entrance. So really functionally, the main entrance is going to be queued into where the most people are arriving from. And so I think we try to lay a groundwork where there's required to be an entrance on equal footing as maybe the one in the parking lot. We have more of those direct connections off the sidewalk, more buildings oriented to transit stops, with the hope being that with that option, it will become more frequently a choice that you could walk there or bike there and enter from that front point of entry and not the parking lot. But a lot of people will continue to arrive by their car. So I think they're in the standards look at how to safely move someone through that parking lot. So again, trying wherever possible to put people on foot at the same status level and priority as the cars moving through those spaces. But yeah, it's definitely a challenging issue, and that's one of enforcement that a lot of people raised, and there's not much that the code can do about enforcement. I think it'll be really interesting to look at. I think one of the most sort of seismic shifts are these drive-through design standards. And if drive-throughs start providing a stop, Dutch Brothers, this is part of their model now, and be really great. That would be a great way to actually get foot traffic counts from them and see and start to gauge. But also fundamentally, that gets to that question of the scale of the land uses around a building and those connections, and frankly, also the street environment. So if we bring that building up to the front, we have that entrance. If the street really still feels like a hostile space, we won't be there yet.
Mm-hmm. Great. All right, so Teresa has a really poignant question, and I don't know how closely you guys are personally following the House bills. I believe 2138 is in legislation right now. It's the governor's housing bill. Teresa's question is really, the bill provides provisions that do not allow for design standards to apply to buildings over 20 units. And so this is a little bit at odds with CFEC. How do you envision kind of legislation versus the state CFEC kind of intersecting, and has there been any discussion about that?
Yeah, I'm going to ask Jamin to weigh in as someone who spends day in and day out looking at housing issues, but I do think there's this inherent tension between standards that ask for more and standards that then affect the overall feasibility and cost of projects. And so definitely there's an inherent tension there. We did pay attention to that and try to think about standards. You know, a good example would be a transparency standard. Well, we identified a range. And it's not just to say it's 75%. That's a very high amount of transparency, which is quite expensive. You know, it may be perfectly adequate to go all the way down to 30% in certain contexts. And so being mindful of those costs. But I think that gets more complicated in that residential setting of trying to not get in the way of really just increasing the pipeline. So I don't know any thoughts you have, Jamin.
No, I have been following HB 2138, but apparently not close enough because I didn't see that most recent amendment. That looks like a new amendment in the last few days or weeks to limit design standards. That's a big change. That would not only change these implementation of these kinds of changes, but also many existing standards that cities currently implement today. So I would be interested in how if the legislation does pass, how the bill defines design standards and how extensive that is. I think you could argue some of the code regulations that are envisioned in the guidebook may not fall only within a definition of design standards. Maybe something more broadly like development standards, something that's, you know, a maximum setback. Is it that different than a minimum setback? So that would be the key question I would start to look at. How broadly does that definition apply? But we are used to having to adjust to when the legislature changes the rules, and so I guess we'll just have to see when that gets when the session ends.
Great, thank you. Let's see, Veronica's been patient. Veronica's question is really about kind of energy efficiency of windows along storefronts and developments. And really wondering if you could kind of weigh in on, like, are there some uses that are more appropriate for that transparency provided by windows versus not?
That's an interesting question. I know we didn't actually look at that question, but another similar example that came up is being a little more culturally responsive. Let's say that there's a certain use where the people inside really don't want that transparency. So I can't remember, Jamin, if it made it into the final model code. I don't think it did, but I think this is one of those key considerations that we included, which is maybe cities should write an exception. And we had some of the things to think about in terms of exceptions to make that a path that an applicant could take a little bit more easily in terms of scenarios where there would be an exception to not require that level of transparency. And that would be a really great element to add to that type of exception. So thanks for raising that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of that's where we basically concluded with the transparency requirement is that there is enough situations or uses where this makes sense and it's beneficial and it really works to activate the street environment, and other features on the facade don't provide that same benefit, right? And so in most cases, it's going to make sense to require it. How you calibrate it and make sure you're not requiring too much, that's a question too. But then there will always be exceptions. There's always exceptions to design and development standards. And so defining your approval criteria for what gets granted as an exception is really important. And there's some recommendations in the model code for that. But I do think many uses would have a very good case to be made for getting an exception to some of those kinds of standards because of the nature of the use. Also that maybe they're proposing an alternative design that they can they would need to then go through a discretionary process where the planning commission or design review board would have some oversight into whether their alternative equally meets the intent of the standard. But that would always be an option, or that's the intent of the model code at least.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I know we've got about 2 minutes left, so I do want to throw out a question that kind of just captures, kind of next steps. And I would be really curious to understand kind of how Cascadia is scoped out for kind of the implementation process. And, it feels like things like this need a little bit of feedback. I know you've been working pretty closely with cities, counties. Kind of what does that runway look like in terms of supporting them, folding that feedback in? Yeah.
Yeah, that, as Jamin mentioned, there's a sort of rolling time frame in terms of when jurisdictions have to actually look at this and comply with this aspect of the rules. But I think we've also, the state at some point created a working group of cities currently undertaking this. And I think that that would be a great area to continue to get input from cities and share across and see what is challenging, what is working, where they've had successes, and get some of that feedback loop. So that would be one option. But currently there's a set of certain number of cities, and us and MIG, I believe, are the only consultants, but correct me if I'm wrong, they're supporting cities in doing code audits and starting to draft code amendments or just create code concepts. So that's the current next steps where we are today.
Awesome. All right, I want to end with a fun question. Is there, I assume you did a lot of research and traveling as part of this and just like seeing things with a different lens. Is there any part of Oregon that you discovered that has like really amazing walkable criteria that you were just blown away by?
This is totally random. It's not the obvious answer, but we recently learned that the city of Ashland super smartly has crafted their signage code to tie into main entries. So you cannot have a sign unless you truly have your main entry there. And that has really worked for them. And I think that is just elegant. So I'll share that. So go look at their signage code.
That's brilliant. Awesome. All right, we are at 1 o'clock. I know folks have to shimmy off to other meetings. Pauline, Jamin, thank you so much for sharing this work. I really appreciate it. Clearly a huge audience today, topic of interest by many. Would say stay tuned for our May UDP panel. I believe we're working on a topic, David. But yeah, check back to our website. And appreciate everyone's attendance and participation today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Go lemonade stands. Thanks to your daughter.
See you soon.